Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sumin Chen. I'll shortly introduce you to Ken Shaw, who will make the presentation today. Title is Microsoft SQL Server and Windows Server Licensing, making the complex simple, and hopefully we live up to the tagline. Just a couple of ground rules. Everyone will be on mute during the conference, but please feel free to use the questions box to ask questions, and we'll be able to answer those during the session. At the end of the session, you can raise your hand, we can unmute you, and you can ask questions directly. There will be a recording sent to you, I think, a couple of hours after the webinar is over. And also, if you want just copies of the slides, please feel free to send an email to info@belarc.com. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Ken Shaw. Ken.
Thank you, Suman. Good morning, everybody. So as the title says, we'll be talking about Microsoft licensing, SQL Server, and Windows Server. And we'll be trying to present the rules in a simple way rather than the complex way that you often hear about them. So we'll be going over the different editions of Windows Server and how to license it. And then we'll do the same thing for SQL Server. We'll go over its editions and how they're individually licensed. And then we'll go through a model license compliance process. The slide here says that we'll do that for both Windows and SQL Server. But we'll shorten things a bit today and just do that for SQL Server. The compliance processes are largely the same for both products, so it'll save a little time. All right, so let's jump into Windows Server. We're talking here about Windows Server 2016. Actually, Microsoft released SQL Server 2019 just a month ago. But as far as I can tell, the rules have not changed. So pretty much everything we tell you about 2016 also applies to Windows Server 2019. So the important additions are the Datacenter, the Standard, and the Essentials. And the Datacenter is the heavyweight product that you use when you want to pack many operating systems onto a single physical server. The Standard is for more sparsely packed servers, so more casual usage, I guess I would say, or servers being shared with other purposes. And then there's Essentials, which is intended for small businesses. So it's a simpler way to set things up, but you're not permitted to use it in a department of a large corporation. So in 2016, the fundamental rule changed as to what you license. It used to be that you license the processor, but with the increase in the number of cores per processor, it's been going on for the last 10 years, 15 years. They finally switched to measuring by cores instead of by processors. As before, licenses are assigned to physical servers. Of course, you're permitted to license by the and you only license by the physical server. I was thinking of SQL Server where things are a little more complicated, but with Windows Server, you license by physical server and you count by the characteristics of the physical server. So the key characteristic is the core. And for a server, you need to get as many licenses as you have cores. But there are also minimums. So for each physical processor, you need at least 8 licenses. And for each physical server, there's a minimum of 16 licenses. So if you bring a very underpowered machine by today's standards, you're still going to get stuck with a higher license level than by the physical characteristics of that server. Okay, so the top edition is the Data Center edition, as mentioned. That's the one you use in compute densitive, highly dense installations. So you're licensing per core, so you need to get as many licenses as cores on the server. Once you've done that licensing, which fully licenses the server, you can use or implement as many OSEs as you want. An OSE is Microsoft's term for a virtual machine. It means an operating system environment. So a POSE is a physical operating system environment. In this case, you can have And of course, you might implement Windows on virtual machines or VOSEs on that physical server. And this says that you're entitled to put as many virtual machines on that physical server as you want. And you do need CALs. So besides licensing the server, you have to license all the users or devices that access the server. The standard edition is a little different. Of course, the licensing model is per core, so that's the same. But what you get when you license the physical server, that is by buying all the licenses you need for the physical server, is you're entitled to run 2 OSEs. So you could just run on the physical server directly, that would be fine, or you could install 2 virtual machines. Now, you might want to run more than 2 virtual machines, say 4 virtual machines. To do that, you need to relicense the physical server, meaning buy as many licenses as you already did in order to license the server. So if you do 4 OSEs, then you have to get twice the number of cores on the server. And if you go to 6, again, you add that same amount. And as with the data center, you have to get CALs. You are permitted, if you're running in 2 virtual machines, to also run a 3rd instance, which is the instance that runs the physical OSE. Of course, without being able to do that, you really couldn't have a running machine. Okay, so finally the Essentials Edition, which is for the small business. In this case, it's not per core, it's per server. So basically you get 1 license, and that allows you to run on 1 physical server. And you can run your instance in either a physical OSE or a virtual OSE. And it gives you up to 25 user accounts, so you do not need to buy additional CALs. And up to 50 different devices can connect to the server. And then there's this thing about domains. And that's basically saying you cannot be a small department in a large corporation. That does not qualify as a small business. Okay, so you can see the licensing for Windows servers pretty simple. Basically because it's the operating system itself. So the complexities of having an application on top of an operating system is not what we're talking about. So we'll, as I said, just skip over this compliance process, and we'll go on to SQL Server. Oh, before we get to that, so obviously you need to have some way of gathering all the information that we were talking about, that is to inventory those computers and find out how many cores they have. And Belarc sells a tool to do that. It's called Data Analytics, and that's built on top of our Bell Manage product. And the combination of the Data Analytics and the Bell Manage gives you an end-to-end or integrated solution. The Bell Manage does a complete discovery, so it'll find all your Windows servers, it'll identify their editions, it'll identify their versions, and it'll identify the physical characteristics of the server, such as the number of processors and number of cores, which, as you saw, are required for the licensing rules. And so here's a screenshot of a report that shows such an inventory of all the installations. And you see Windows Server along the bottom. And it's computing the number of licenses required based on all that discovery data and the rules. The second thing it can do is it can accept your entitlement records in a repository that it has. And then it will combine those entitlement records with the discovery that it did and compute an effective license position. And this is a screenshot of a report showing an effective license position. So it's actually reconciled what was discovered with what was installed, and can show you how many licenses you need, how many you have, and what the difference is. Okay, so now we'll go on to SQL Server 2016. As with Windows Server, they actually have a newer edition. There's a SQL Server 2017. But again, as far as I can see, the rules for SQL Server 2017 are the same as for 2016. So what we present here should apply to the latest version that Microsoft is selling. So we'll go over the editions and the licensing rules, and then we'll go over that model license compliance process. So there are a bunch of editions of SQL Server. You see them listed here. The ones that really matter are the Enterprise, the Standard, and the Express. The Express matters because it's free, so it's very important to know about that, because if the Express will do the job for you, then that's the way to go, save money. But as far as licensing and knowing the rules and being in compliance, it's the Enterprise and Standard that you really care about. So the Enterprise is the heavyweight product, whereas the Standard is the more lightweight, smaller task kind of product. So it has lesser capabilities, but it also costs less. There are capacity limits on the different editions. So the important thing to know is that, practically speaking, the capacity limits on the Enterprise per core don't exist. You can throw as much hardware on it as you want. Whereas the Standard is limited to 4 sockets or 24 cores. So you can't throw all the hardware you want at it and say, well, Standard's cheap and maybe limited in the software, but at least I can throw as much hardware as I want at it. In fact, you cannot. So you see the limits there. And the Express product, which is the free one, is very limited. And of course, Microsoft doesn't want you to be able to use Express for everything you do, or they wouldn't be getting any revenues for SQL Server. But still, it lets you use 1 gigabyte of memory and have a database of 10 gigabytes. There are quite a few tasks that can handle. Okay, just a little more detail on how it is that Enterprise Edition is the superior product standard. And basically it has a bunch of better things. That is, you can do better management with certain capabilities, you get better performance with certain capabilities, you get better reliability, and finally you get better security. So those are all important for if you're a large organization and you've got a database that's significant to the whole enterprise.
Ken, are you still there?
An inventory to actually count the number of cores that you need licenses for, since every one is significant. But you can see the ratio of the Standard to the Enterprise is pretty significant. So if you can get by with the Standard, you can save quite a bit of money over the Enterprise. Okay, so we'll basically talk about the Enterprise and Standard. You see the business intelligence in there. That was published, I think, in 2012 and 2014, and not since then. So that's pretty much history at this point. So the most basic thing is licenses are assigned to physical servers. That's the same thing I mentioned with Windows, but that's important to emphasize here because you can, in some cases, count your licensing by the virtual machine characteristics that the software is installed on. But still, in the end, the licenses have to be associated with the physical server. So in general, when you license by core, which is one of the methods, you need a license for every core that's being used. If you're doing the server licensing, which is server plus CALs, you need a license for the server, and you need CALs for every user or device that accesses the server. So you'll notice in the table above that the Enterprise can be licensed by core or by server, and so can the Standard. But the Enterprise is not really available anymore per server. It's just there because if you have an old version of Enterprise, you can upgrade it, but it's not possible to buy new licenses with Enterprise Server. And I think they last sold those in 2012, so they're getting pretty far back in the rearview mirror. So you have to make a new purchase between the two license types as if you're getting the Standard. Okay, some more general rules before we get into each edition. The first is if you have licensed a server and licensed the operating system environments on it, you can run as many instances of SQL Server as you want. Some Microsoft products don't give you that flexibility, but SQL Server does. The second thing is there's this 4-core minimum thing you have to keep in mind. And that applies both in physical OSEs and virtual OSEs. It means if you just got one core that you're using and you say, wow, just one, I'm going to save a lot of money. The answer is not quite. You still have to pay for at least 4 cores in most situations. There is an exception that we'll get to. So we'll touch on this again when we do some examples. And the other thing is that when you're dealing with the virtual environment and you're counting virtual cores, Microsoft says you can't just count the virtual cores that the virtual machine tells you. You have to pay attention to what's underneath the hood. And if that virtual core actually corresponds to a physical core and the physical core is running a couple of hyperthreads, then Microsoft says, oh, that's 2 virtual cores for licensing, not 1. So that means they're making it your responsibility to know whether the physical cores underneath the virtuals are hyper-threaded or not. Okay, so let's go through the different cases. Basically, we're going to talk about standard and enterprise and per server and per core. So the first instance will be the standard with the per server licensing. So 1 license gives you 1 OSE, meaning 1 server, virtual or physical. And you need to get as many licenses as OSEs you're using. And then you need to get the CALs to go with it. And don't forget that you're not supposed to run this edition on an OSE that has more than 16 cores. So here's an example where we're doing the standard per server in a physical operating system environment. We have an example here that has 4 CPUs on the server, and each CPU has 4 cores, so there's 16 cores in total. Since it's a per server license and you need 1 license per server, that's what you need, just 1 server license. The CPUs and cores don't matter, except that you need to stay under that 16 core limit, which this example does. So that's simple. So let's go to the virtual operating system environment, a little more complicated. In this case, you've installed SQL Server on a pair of virtual machines. So we're not paying any direct attention to the physical environment that's hosting these virtual machines. Although we're showing the physical environment here, but I'm saying for licensing, the physical environment doesn't matter. So we got 2 machines. Each of them happens to have 2 CPUs and 4 cores apiece. But again, since it's per server, they don't matter. It's just 2 servers, so you need 2 licenses and the associated CALs for the users and devices. Okay, so now we'll go to the second case, still the standard edition, but now we'll switch over to the per core licensing rules. So you need 1 license for every core in the environments that you're using, whether it's virtual or physical. If you're running in the physical operating system environment, then you need a license for every core on the physical server. Doesn't matter whether you think that SQL Server is using only some of the cores. You have to pay for all of the cores. And the logic is the same if you're running in a virtual machine or a set of virtual machines. You count all the virtual cores and all the virtual machines being used. And again, if the SQL Server inside the VOSE is not using all the cores, it doesn't matter. You have to count all the virtual cores. A big simplification when you license per core is you do not need CALs. So you don't have to count the number of users or devices that are accessing the database system. So that can be a real value if that task is difficult to do. And of course, it means there's no extra cost beyond the cost of the server, so you don't have to factor in the extra cost when you do your calculations. All right, so let's do some examples. So first, we'll do an example where we're using the per core licensing rules of a SQL Server installation in the physical operating system environment. So we have the same computer we saw earlier that has 4 CPUs and 4 cores in every CPU. So there's a total of 16 cores, and that means you need 16 licenses. There's a mention here of a thing called a core factor. I don't believe that even applies in SQL Server 2016. It used to apply in earlier per core versions, and it had to do with different CPUs having different powers and Microsoft taking that into account. But those CPUs where it mattered are pretty ancient these days, so you probably don't have any of those in your environment anyhow. Okay, so now we'll switch over, same license model. We're doing the per core licensing for the standard edition, but now we're looking at the virtual environment. So in this case, we've taken our physical system and divided it up into 2 virtual machines. And they're not the same. You can see the virtual machine on the left just has 2 cores of 1 CPU allocated to it. The one on the right has 2 CPUs with a total of 8 cores allocated to it. So if you count the number of cores, you come up with 10. But that machine on the left that has just the 2 cores is subject to that 4-core minimum rule. So you have to license it for 4 cores. So you need 4 cores for the left machine and 8 cores for the right machine. And that's what gives you a total of 12 cores being used, and so 12 licenses are needed. And again, no CALs are required. Okay, so now we'll turn to the Enterprise Edition. And I mentioned there is a per server license available, but it's only legacy. So you had to have bought Enterprise per server way back around 2012 or so. If you do have that, what you're entitled to is to run in 4 OSEs on a given physical server. So you can run directly in the physical server, or you can run 4 virtual machines. You do need CALs, and there is a hardware limitation, so you can't go above 20 cores. So this legacy machine cannot be as powerful as you could do with today's per core licensing. Okay, so now let's switch from the per server to the one that really matters today, which is per core licensing. And this is a little more complicated, certainly more complicated than the per server stuff, and more complicated than the standard, because there's 2 ways to do it. So the first rule to keep in mind is you need 1 license for every core. That's the same as it was for standard. And if you're running your SQL Server in the physical environment, then you have to license by the physical cores and count all the physical cores. On the other hand, if you're running in virtual environments, that is 1 or more virtual machines, then you can count your licensing either by counting the physical cores or by counting the virtual cores. And so what you want to do is count it both ways and then see which number is smaller and use that smaller number. So as I said, if you're licensing by the physical core, just count all the physical cores. So the total number of physical cores is the cap on the number of licenses that you need. Well, actually there's a twist on that, I'll get to that. If you're licensing by virtual cores, you count all the virtual cores of all the virtual machines that are running SQL Server. So what this means is if you have a machine where let's say it's a big machine, and you put 1 enterprise installation in there on 1 virtual machine, then you'd want to do things by virtual cores, because presumably the number of virtual cores on that virtual machine are a fraction of the total on the physical. On the other hand, if you put many virtual machines on there, it could be that the total number of, and you put SQL Server on every one of those virtual machines, it could be that the total number of virtual cores exceeds the number of physical cores. in that case, you'd want it licensed by the physical core because that would cap it for you. Now, this last line is important, which says bonus, where you can get unlimited virtualization. If you don't have unlimited virtualization, then in fact, you're limited as far as the number of virtual machines you can put in there and the number of virtual cores they use. And you're supposed to be limited to the number of physical cores. But if you have the software assurance, then you can do unlimited virtualization, which means you can put as many virtual machines on there as you want, and they can have way more total number of virtual cores than physical cores, but you still pay for just the physical cores. So if you really want to be capped at the number of physical cores, you have to have the software assurance. Otherwise, you really can't go beyond the number of physical cores, even when you're setting up a virtual environment. So let's look at some examples. So here's our same old machine with the 4 CPUs and the 4 cores. And we've installed SQL Server in the physical environment. So we need 16 core licenses because we have 16 cores. So now we have a couple of examples for the virtual environment. So it doesn't show really clearly here in the graphics, but let's just say you had 16 virtual machines. So you had 16 virtual machines, and every virtual machine was allocated just a single physical core. So you've got a total of 16 virtual cores. In that case, if you do it by the virtual, you need 16 licenses, which is the same as counting the physical. But, you know, instead of doing 16, maybe you're going to do 10. And if you do 10, then instead of needing 16 licenses, you need just 10 licenses. Now you'll note here that the 4 core minimum is not being applied. That is the case I said where you did the 10 virtual machines and each virtual machine had 1 core, that's 10 licenses. That's a benefit of the enterprise per core licensing, that when you do things by the virtual counting method, you don't have to apply the 4 core minimum inside each virtual machine. So I was actually talking about this example just a moment ago, so we'll kind of do this again, but instead of having 16, we'll talk about just having 2 virtual machines. So instead of having 1 virtual machine for every single core, we're going to have bigger virtual machines here. 2 cores on the left and 8 cores on the right. So in this case, actually, let me back up because I'm confusing you and myself. This counting here, we're running in the virtual machines, but we're counting by physical cores. So we need 16 cores because there's 16 physical cores. Now in this other case where we're installed in the virtuals, but we're going to count by the virtual method, we have this case of 2 virtual machines with 2 cores on the left and 8 on the right. Here the 4 core minimum applies. So the machine on the left needs 4 cores. The machine on the right needs 8, and we end up with a total of 12 cores. It's still smaller than 16, so that's good. Coming back to the earlier case, this is useful. That is, we're running in virtuals. As I said, you might have 10, you might have 16. You're able to count each individual core as just needing 1 license and not hitting the 4 core minimum. So when you have lots of virtual machines in there, then the physical option is better because you don't get hit by the factor of 4. You can see here in this case, we have just 2 virtual machines and we're already up to 12 cores. If we put another couple of virtual machines on there, we'd be well beyond the 16 cores. And that's why the physical is useful, because it'll limit the total count to 16 instead of going up to 20 or 24 or 32. Okay, a few observations on the licensing options, which really only apply in standard because enterprise With a new license, you must license per core. But with standard, you can choose per server or per core. So the thing to take into account is, number one, if you do per server, you need cals. And if you're going to have cals, you have to count the number. So there has to be some way to count the number of users or devices. And typically, for example, when you have a web-facing product, you can't count the number of users or it's enormous, in which case per core licensing is the way to go. On the other hand, if you've got something in-house and there's a small number of users, then you might be better off because the per server price by itself is less than the per core price. And if the addition of those few users doesn't bring it over the per core price, then the per server will be cheaper. So when you're doing standard, you need to look at those things ahead of time in order to choose the best license type. Then there's the question of software assurance. It's not just maintenance so that you can get the next version when it comes out, but they also give you certain rights. I mentioned on the enterprise core licensing that there was a thing called unlimited virtualization. So that's what lets you put in as many virtual machines as you want, going even beyond the number of cores on the physical processor and not have to pay more for doing that. So that's valuable if you've got the kind of databases where it's worthwhile to have even more of them than you have cores. And the other is this thing called license mobility, which is the right to move licenses from one server to another. And you get a lot more flexibility to do that if you have software assurance. There's also a thing called failover. That's when you have a passive server paired with an active server, and the purpose of the passive server is to sit there doing nothing but be ready to take over if the active server fails. So it's a way to get more reliability. And you have the rights to do that. And by do that, I mean have that passive server and not pay a license for it if you have software assurance. Okay, so we'll come to the last stage of the presentation, which is to go through a model license compliance process. So there are basically three steps that you do when you do licensing compliance. The first is you have to discover all the installations of the software you have and then compute how many licenses are required for all those installations. And then you have to do a counterpart, which is to discover all the entitlements that you have. And after you've gotten each of those sets of information well organized, then you can compare them to each other and see for each product where you're over licensed and where you're under licensed and by how much. So we have a couple of tables here that illustrate this, and that's what I'll describe now. So we'll do this assuming that we're talking about SQL Server. But as I said, the process is similar, a little simpler actually for Windows Server. In the case of SQL Server, you have to worry about SQL Server itself, and you have to worry about the operating system that it's running on. So in the first step, you want to find or tabulate all the SQL Server installations that you have. So you see the columns on the left are describing the SQL Server installation. We identify it by the edition and the version. And the column on the left called the instance, that's the name of it, which is something that you give to a SQL Server installation when you install it. You see the color coding of the rows. That's to distinguish the Enterprise Edition from the Standard Edition, just to make that a little easier to see. There's also the fact that the server type that it's on is a physical machine, and we're highlighting that, whereas the server type below for the Standard Edition or virtual machine. On that server type column, the P means it's a physical server, and the V means it's a virtual server. So let's just assume the first thing you've done essentially here is identified the installations. The next thing you need to do is fully associate those installations with their servers. We did a little bit of that in the first slide, but we're doing something more critical here. So you see on the left side, instead of showing the SQL Server instances, we're now giving prominence to the computers or the hosts of the SQL Server. And so in the server column, we're naming the servers. And in the second column, called the set column, we're showing how virtual machines are grouped together with their physical host. And the third column is saying whether the installations are on a physical or a virtual. So in the first row, where we're looking at an enterprise edition, that enterprise edition is installed directly on a physical server. And you can see the name of the server. The bottom two rows are the virtual machines that are hosting those two SQL Server installations called green and blue. And they're running on the standard edition. And what's added to this table compared to the previous table is that second row with server B. And that's a physical machine. And that's the physical host of the two virtual machines below. So the server is called B and the hosted virtuals are B1 and B2. And so that's beyond just discovering the SQL Server installations. You could find the SQL Server installations by talking to your database administrators or their managers. And they would know about all their SQL Server instances, at least in theory. But it's a separate step when the SQL Server is installed on a virtual machine to know which virtual machines go together with the same physical host and what the characteristics of that physical host are. And as you saw from the earlier licensing rules, there are many cases where you're going to do the licensing not by the virtual machine characteristics, but by the physical. Not always, but you might. And it might be an option to do it one way or the other, as we saw with the enterprise. So you really need to get that information about the physical hosts so that you can either do the licensing that's required or have the option to do the lowest cost licensing. And you'll see on the right, the important characteristics of the servers are added. That is the number of cores and CPUs. And so given all these characteristics of the operating system environments and the instances and versions of the SQL Server, we can compute the number of licenses required. Now, there's something more to say there. So you look at the first row, and you see the license count is 16. And that's a straightforward, hey, it's enterprise, it's being licensed per core. So 16 cores means 16 licenses are required. The standard cases are a little trickier. So what's going on there is we see there are 16 cores. That's in the second row. So we could say we need 16 licenses if we decide to do it by the physical core. But we can see in the lower two rows that each of those virtual machines is only using 2 cores. Now, it's standard, so we have to do the 4-core minimum. So each of those 2 bottom rows needs actually 4 licenses each. So 4 and 4 is 8. And that's why there's an 8 in the license count in the second row. So the server B, which is the physical host, needs 8 licenses to cover those 2 hosted virtual machines. And the last step in the process is to summarize by product, counting across the machines. So you see here, we're not looking at particular machines or cores. We're just looking at different products. And we've summed the license counts from the previous table. So the essential thing is it's a certain edition, a certain version, a certain license type, and then a license total for each product. So the counterpart to discovering the number of licenses required is the number of licenses you're entitled to, which is what you've purchased. So here's a simple table showing some individual line items from some purchase orders that purchased SQL Server licenses. And what was purchased is identified by an edition, a version, a license type. We do show the version here. If you had software assurance, then you're entitled to all versions, and the version wouldn't matter. It's a good idea to have tallied it in discovery. But if you have software assurance, then you're not limited to that particular version, but to any version. So the important things would be the edition and the license type. So in practice, of course, you might have many more rows than this, reflecting many more purchases over time, and you probably have different editions and versions, and you might have a mix of license types. You might have earlier purchases that were per server or per core. And so the next step is to summarize over the different purchases so that you have a total per edition and a license type. So naturally, we pretty much just have two when we're talking about the modern ones, because we have enterprise core and standard core. Although you could be licensing standard per server in addition and have a third row. So now that this is summarized, you can find to the last step, which is to do the reconciliation, also known as the effective license position, meaning the comparison of how many you're entitled to versus how many you're obligated to have. And so if you were able to keep those tables in mind that we saw before, they each had the edition and the version and the license type. So we were able to combine the like rows with the like rows. And then as far as the counts, we took the installed count from the discovery table and we took the purchase count from the entitled table. And now the numbers are side by side. And so you can see that you're over-licensed in one case, under-licensed, I'm sorry, because you have more installed than you've purchased. In the bottom row, they're equal. So the bottom row is nice. You've purchased just exactly what you need. In the top case, you're under purchased, meaning you need to make purchase of some more licenses or tell somebody, hey, you're not supposed to have that installed over there. Get rid of that. So as I mentioned earlier, this process can be very difficult. Just to remind you, you need to discover the software installations across your whole environment. And then you need to get the characteristics of the server that they're installed on. And then you need to understand whether that server is a physical or a virtual. And if it's a virtual, you need to find its physical host and get the characteristics of its physical host. And then you need to group the virtual machines that are on the same physical host together. And that's a complicated process. And then, of course, to do the reconciliation, you have to apply the licensing rules that we've talked about to the software and the computers and their cores and their groupings in order to finally come up with the effective license position. And Belarc offers a tool to do that. Again, that's the data analyst based on the Bell Managed product. And so this is a screenshot of a report showing discovery. So this is, you can see SQL Server installations in the top rows, and the edition and the version and the license type are being identified. And that server set type that has those cryptic letters about OV and V on P and P, that's identifying the relationship between virtual and physical machines as they affect the licensing. And then on the far right, which you finally care about, which is the number of licenses that are required for that installation. And finally, a screenshot of an effective license position, which brings together the data from the previous report and your entitlements, and does a reconciliation to show you where you're under licensed and where you're over licensed. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sumin to open things up for questions.
Great.
We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, either in general or to go back to any of the slides and review something that might not have been clear.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you. Debbie, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. I am fairly new to licensing Microsoft, and one of the terms that I'm still confused by, and I was hoping you would cover on here, is CAL. Can you go a little bit deeper into CAL, what that means and what I'm doing when I'm licensing by CAL?
Sure. So CAL is an acronym for Client Access License. And it actually refers to either a device, such as a computer or a kiosk, or to a person. And what they're saying is, if you decide to license per server, which gives you a flat cost per server by the server licensing itself, we also want you to pay us according to how much you use it. And so we want to measure the number of users and devices, which is kind of a measurement of the value that you get out of it. And we want you to pay a relatively small fixed price for every one of those. Now I say a relatively small, but it might be small in total if it's 10, but if it's 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 users times a relatively small number, it starts to get very expensive. And so it could be that the price for those CALs could exceed the cost for the server proper. And that plays to your choice on standard where you have that choice to whether you want to license per server or per core. Because the per core, generally speaking, for the server proper is more expensive, but that's the end of your costs. You have unlimited number of users.
Yeah, one other thing to keep in mind, Debbie, on the server cal licensing is that you have to take into consideration third-party tools that may be accessing SQL Server, and then you've got all the third-party users to those tools. So it's not just direct users of SQL Server, but if you have applications that are using SQL Server that have additional users, you have to count those users too. So just make sure that third-party users get counted also.
Yeah, I would add that that's actually probably the most common case, and that besides needing to do that to be licensed, that is itself a factor to take into account, because when it comes to licensing compliance, that can be a lot of work to figure out. Because when you have that third-party application, it makes one connection, one login to the database, but there's no record in SQL Server of all those users using it. And often it's a kind of a manual hunting process to find all the users of that third-party application. And you may have many of those, and you have to hunt each one down in a different way.
Yeah, but keep in mind also that once you've bought a cal for a user, they can use any number of instances of SQL Server. So what a lot of organizations do is they just license everyone in the organization. That way they're covered, and they can have, as long as they're paying for the server licenses, they can have any number of SQL servers that those users access. So you really do need to go through and run the numbers, and that's one of the things that a tool like Belarc can help you do. But there are definitely a reason to run both scenarios, both server cal and processor types, and do that comparison. Did that help answer your question?
That was actually an excellent explanation.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, on your very last statement, you mentioned you bought a cal for a user, then that user is entitled to use any server in the or
yes.
Is it any server and SQL Server, or
no,
is
SQL
it
server.
a
SQL
server and a SQL?
SQL
Okay.
Server, yeah, SQL Server. Yeah, so if you're licensing a SQL Server cal, that only applies to SQL Server. Now there are cal packages too. We can get more complex into this, but there are packages of cals that you can buy from Microsoft. So they include Windows Server cals, SQL Server cals, and SharePoint cals. So you could take a look at those packages also. In some cases, that will lower your total cost also. Clear as a bell, right?
It is. That was very helpful.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Any more questions? Nope. Oops, we've got one, VJ. Let me unmute you. Yes, VJ.
Yeah. So I have a doubt. In some of people, they are using the DRS cluster for the virtual servers, right? So how we can able to validate and map the virtuals against the physicals if it is been in a DRS cluster environment?
Right. So the way typically that goes to your, you have to talk to if you're doing it manually, you need to talk to the operations people. Typically the database administrators don't really know which virtuals are running on which physicals. So you need to talk to your server operations guys to see if they can give you the data on which physicals are running on, which virtuals are hosted by which physical machines. If you're running in VMware, as you mentioned, you can get that information automatically out of the vCenter console. And actually, Belarc discovers it that way automatically too. So there are some automated methods that you could use to do that discovery, both in vCenter and vMotion management consoles.
Okay. So whether it can be discovered by the maps, the Microsoft tool?
Oh, the Microsoft map? I don't actually know if MAP does that. My guess is it does not. MAP tends to focus on Microsoft products. I don't know if they have an interface to VMware. I'm not sure, but if it's just Microsoft's virtualization, you probably can get that information. But if it's VMware, probably not. But I can't swear to that. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Any other questions? No. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, if you would like copies of the slides, please send an email to info@belarc.com, and we will send it to you. In addition, you'll also be getting a recording of the presentation in a couple of hours. So look forward to seeing you join us in future webinars, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.